Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The rain had just stopped when the acceptance letters arrived. The air still held the scent of thunder, thick, alive, unsettled. A certain kind of hush had blanketed the neighborhood, like a fresh bedsheet spread across a weary mattress. Lizzie and Blessing sat side by side on the worn leather couch they'd both fallen asleep on countless times after late-night reading, their names glinting from ivory envelopes that smelled of ambition and freshly printed futures. Lizzie was already crying before hers was halfway open. Blessing, on the other hand, tore hers open with the mechanical resolve of someone peeling yam skin. No joy, just obligation. They had both finished from Newton Law School, with results that would make any parent beam, but only one of them had wanted that victory. For Lizzie, it was a dream stitched into her soul from childhood. For Blessing, it was a badge her father insisted she wear, like a medal from a war she never enlisted in. And so, while Lizzie galloped into legal practice like a mare released onto open pasture, Blessing staggered into it like someone carrying water in a basket, drained before she could begin. That evening, as Lizzie picked out skirts for court and rehearsed her introductions in the mirror, Blessing sat cross-legged on the floor, shading a charcoal sketch of a barefoot girl standing in the middle of a road that split into two. Her hands were black with graphite, her heart heavier than it had ever been. They had found a modest place in the North Bay Lane district, a sun-dusted townhouse that looked older than its years, but wore its cracks with a kind of stubborn dignity. The kind of place where lizards chased each other across fences, and where the neighbor's rooster crowed not only at dawn, but whenever it damn well pleased. The rent was manageable, the walls thick enough to muffle most of Lizzie's legal ramblings, and the front porch had just enough space for Blessing to sit and draw when the mood struck, which was often. Though they were bound by a decade-long friendship, the differences between them began to stretch like chewing gum left in the sun. Lizzie talked about cases, clients, contracts. Blessing listened with one ear and nodded like a branch too tired to resist the wind. She tried, she really did. But the fire wasn't in her belly. It was in her fingers, her sketch pads, the smudge of ink on her elbows at midnight. Her father, Chief Dominic Adebayo, didn't know half of it. He believed she was practicing, just as he had ordained. In truth, she hadn't stepped foot in a courtroom since graduation. Their weekly calls were full of edited stories, polite nods, and silent sighs. The last time he visited, he had walked into her art studio by mistake and stared at a half-finished painting of a crying child. "You still draw?" he had said, like someone asking if a grown woman still sucked her thumb. Blessing had laughed. But it was the kind of laugh that cracked something inside her, the kind that left splinters in your chest long after the sound faded. She wasn't fond of children, never had been. To her, they were messy creatures with sticky hands and loud questions that never stopped pouring like water from a broken tap. Their cries grated her nerves. Their giggles seemed like nails scraping a blackboard. Lizzie had once joked that Blessing must have skipped the day God was handing out maternal instincts. Blessing didn't mind. She had no plans of having any. "They ruin everything," she had once muttered under her breath at a birthday party Lizzie dragged her to. A balloon had popped beside her and she nearly dropped her drink. The birthday girl had spilled juice on her sketch pad and her mother merely laughed it off. That day, Blessing swore that children and her destiny were two lines that would never intersect. So she built her life like a quiet fortress, just her pencils, and the soft rustling sound of pages flipping under her fingertips. Every time she passed a creche or a playground, she walked faster, like someone hurrying past a crime scene. No time for chaos. No patience for tantrums. She believed she was too full of storms to carry the storms of another tiny soul. But life, as always, had a way of slipping its fingers into the cracks we pretend don't exist, tugging threads we thought were sewn tight. One Thursday afternoon, with the sun behaving like a hot-headed dictator and the streets of Northby Lane shimmering like stretched aluminum foil, Blessing decided to step out. Her favorite pencils, Faber-Castell 6B, had run out, and nothing irked her more than starting a new sketch with a borrowed line. She crossed the road, dodged the Danfo buses honking like overfed geese, and walked briskly into Westwood Supplies. The store smelled like old books and ambition, her favorite scent. She didn't expect anyone to be there, certainly not anyone loitering near the art section. But there she was. A girl no taller than Blessing's shoulder, standing barefoot in a summer dress patterned with sunflowers, holding the last set of 6B pencils like a trophy. Blessing's steps slowed, her brow furrowed. She reached out calmly, not wanting to make a scene. The girl turned, looked her square in the eye, and said with a shrug, "I got here first, so it's mine." It wasn't the words that struck Blessing, it was the way she said it. Not with sass, but with quiet assurance, as if she had earned her place in the world and saw no reason to apologize for it. Blessing blinked. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. The girl smiled, not mockingly, just sincerely, and walked off. Blessing stood frozen, hands still outstretched, like someone trying to catch rain with their palm long after the clouds had moved on. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that this small encounter was the first domino. That child, that tiny interruption to her routine, was about to rip the floorboards from under her carefully curated world. The sun had barely dried its tears from yesterday's rain when Lizzie barged into the sitting room with a folded letter in one hand and her phone in the other. Her heels clapped against the tiled floor like a warning bell. Blessing didn't even lift her eyes from the sketch she was finishing. It was a drawing of the girl from the shop, not intentional at first, but the eyes had refused to become anyone else's. "We're being kicked out," Lizzie said, her tone stretched between disbelief and irritation. Blessing blinked once, slow like a cat refusing to be startled. "What are you talking about?" Lizzie waved the letter in the air. "The house. It belonged to some old man, Mr. Graymore. He died last month. Apparently, his son is reclaiming all the properties under the estate. They want us out by the end of next month." For a moment, the only sound was the whir of the standing fan rotating between them, its blades spinning like thoughts in Blessing's mind. She dropped her pencil, gently, as though any sudden motion might shatter her reality further. "So what? We find another place?" Lizzie laughed without humor. "Have you seen rent prices lately?" There was a pause, a thick, heavy kind of silence, the kind that felt like someone had just placed a stone on your chest. Blessing slowly picked up her sketch pad and tore the page with the girl's drawing from it, crumpling it until it looked like regret in her hand. "It's just a house," she murmured. But her voice betrayed her. This house had become a sanctuary, a haven from her father's expectations, from the legal world that didn't fit, from the ghosts of a childhood filled with rules and the cold clang of unreachable affection. 2 days later, the new landlord arrived. He was nothing like what Blessing imagined. Ethan Graymore was tall, sharply dressed, and spoke in clipped tones that left no room for small talk. His face held the kind of handsomeness that didn't beg to be noticed, the kind that aged like expensive leather, quietly, confidently. He had come with documents, a surveyor, and a look that made it clear he was not here to sympathize. Blessing had just stepped out to dispose of charcoal dust when she caught sight of him examining the gate, murmuring instructions to the man beside him. Their eyes met, and it was like two swords touching, not striking yet, but close. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice crisp enough to cut yam. Ethan looked at her briefly. "I'm here for the property assessment. My father used to own this place." "Used to," she echoed, emphasizing the past, "until he died and you showed up to sweep in like a hawk." His brow lifted slightly. "Excuse me?" Blessing shrugged. "Nothing. Just interesting timing." Lizzie would later scold her for the exchange, but Blessing didn't care. Something about the man irked her, his detachment, his cold tone, the way he seemed to have reduced a home into measurements and market value. She returned to her studio, slamming the door with just enough force to be heard, but not loud enough to be called petty. Through the blinds, she watched him walk the perimeter of the house with that same calculating gaze. But what neither of them knew, what would have flipped that moment on its head, was that the very girl who had walked away with Blessing's pencil at Westwood Supplies was Ethan Graymore's only daughter. The days rolled by like lazy clouds, nothing dramatic, yet everything quietly shifting underfoot. Blessing couldn't stop thinking about the girl from the shop. Something about her had burrowed into her thoughts like a seed determined to sprout in unlikely soil. Her sketchpad, now half filled with unfinished drawings of the same sunflower-dressed girl, lay open on the studio floor like a diary she couldn't bring herself to read. She tried to push it aside, focusing instead on apartment listings that all looked like punishment for sins she hadn't committed. Lizzie worked long hours, her absence growing like a shadow across their friendship. Blessing began spending more time on the porch, letting the silence of dusk braid itself into her thoughts. It was during one of those aimless twilights that she saw her again, this time at the corner store. The girl was browsing through a rack of coloring books, her eyes lighting up with every flip of a page. Blessing hesitated. She didn't want to approach. But the girl looked up, and as if fate had written the scene in invisible ink, their eyes locked again. "Hey," the girl said with a grin, "you're the pencil lady." Blessing blinked. "You again?" "You remember me," she replied like it was a victory. "You're hard to forget," Blessing muttered. The girl came closer. "I draw too. Do you want to see one of mine?" Blessing hesitated, but curiosity tugged harder than pride. "All right," she said finally. The girl flipped open a small notepad. Inside was a sketch of a treehouse, with birds fluttering around it. It was raw, imperfect, but full of heart. Blessing stared longer than necessary. "Not bad," she whispered. The girl's eyes sparkled. "My name's Ivy." What followed wasn't planned. Blessing didn't mean to give her number, but Ivy had a way of planting herself into moments and making you forget you ever said no. "So I can send you my drawings," she had said innocently, and Blessing, almost like someone under hypnosis, nodded and wrote it down. Over the next few days, Ivy would send pictures, sketches of her cat, the view from her window, once even a drawing of Blessing herself, captured in surprising detail. Blessing replied sparingly, but always looked forward to the buzz of her phone. Ivy's texts were like notes slipped into a bottle, small, hopeful, always afloat with wonder. But what caught Blessing off guard was the visit. Ivy had somehow gotten the address and convinced her uncle, Ethan's younger brother, to drop her off at the townhouse. That day, Blessing had just finished washing brushes when the knock came. She opened the door to Ivy's smiling face. "Surprise!" The words tumbled out like laughter. Blessing was too stunned to scold her. "You can't just show up," she said, even as she let her in. They talked, shared snacks, flipped through sketches. Ivy's energy lit up the house like morning sun after a storm, but the peace was short-lived. A key turned in the lock. The front door swung open. Ethan stepped in and froze. His daughter, in the home of the woman who had once spoken to him like he was an eyesore on the earth's skin. His eyes widened. Blessing stood. Ivy said, "Daddy, look who I found." The room thickened with unspoken words. Ethan's jaw clenched. "What is this?" he barked at his brother, who had just stepped in behind. "Why would you bring her here?" "She begged," his brother replied. "I didn't see the harm." "There's plenty of harm," Ethan growled, glaring at Blessing like she had committed treason. And then, just like that, he left, dragging Ivy with him. The door shut so hard behind them it sounded like a chapter closing. Blessing hadn't planned to miss Ivy, but the house felt unnaturally quiet after she left. The girls' laughter had filled the corners like a stubborn echo that refused to leave. Blessing sat alone on the same couch where Ivy had perched just hours earlier, tracing her finger along the rim of a juice-stained glass Ivy had left behind. Her heart, though not fully aware of its own betrayal, ached in a new way, as though something that hadn't belonged had suddenly become indispensable. Lizzie returned home later that night to find Blessing sketching with a focused fury she hadn't seen in months. "You all right?" she asked cautiously. Blessing didn't respond. Her eyes stayed glued to the charcoal lines forming Ivy's smile, wide, mischievous, full of defiant innocence. It wasn't until the second glass of Zobo that Lizzie nudged further. "So who was the girl?" Blessing's voice, when it came, was a whisper. "Ivy. She draws." That was all she said. But deep inside, it felt like her mind was a pot that had started boiling quietly, lid rattling, unsure whether to spill or simmer. The girl had stormed into her life like a breeze slipping through an unlatched window, uninvited but oddly welcome. Blessing couldn't understand why Ivy's absence now rang louder than her presence ever did. Her fingers tingled every time her phone lit up, hoping it would be her, and when it wasn't, she'd sigh so deeply it felt like air was leaking out of her soul. She didn't recognize herself. She, who had sworn off children like one swears off poison, now sat wishing for a child's company. It wasn't magic. It wasn't maternal instinct. It was something else, something nameless. Perhaps it was the beginning of being undone. Ethan hadn't expected to be angry, but his blood boiled with the kind of heat only disappointment could brew. He paced his living room like a lion in a too-small cage, stopping only to glance at Ivy curled on the couch, arms folded, lips pressed into a silent protest. She hadn't said a word since they got home, and he could tell her silence wasn't ordinary. It was the kind that screamed. He had called his brother reckless, accused him of poor judgment, and banned Ivy from leaving the house for the week. But none of it had broken her resolve. She skipped dinner, ignored breakfast, and refused to take her vitamins. On the third day, she walked into his study and dropped a single line like a stone into still water. "I'm not eating until I see Auntie Blessing." Ethan looked up, startled. "That's not a request you get to make," he said. Ivy didn't flinch. "Then don't make me eat." He dismissed her at first, thinking she was bluffing. But hours turned into a day, and a day into two. By the time he realized how serious she was, her eyes had begun to sink slightly, her laughter had packed its bags, and her voice was starting to sound like sandpaper. He tried coaxing. He tried threats. Nothing worked. Finally, he stood with his phone in hand, staring at Blessing's number, unsure what to say. Their last interaction had been charged with tension and resentment, but none of that mattered now. His daughter was unraveling, and if there was one person who could thread her back together, it was the woman he least wanted to call. When she picked up, her voice was cautious. "Ethan?" "It's Ivy," he said. She's not well. She's refusing to eat. She keeps asking for you." There was a pause, so thick it could have been sliced with a bread knife. Then, softly, she said, "I'll come." Blessing hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she exhaled just before knocking. The Graymore house loomed larger than she remembered, wrapped in cold silence like a chapel at nightfall. When the door opened and Ethan stepped aside, she couldn't read his face. It was blank, a mask carved from stone. Ivy's room was softly lit, a warm amber hue leaking from a bedside lamp. There she was, pale but smiling. "You came," she whispered. Blessing nodded, stepping closer. "Of course I did." Ivy threw her arms around her, and the gesture felt like rain on parched earth. They sat together, flipping through drawings and giggling at silly sketches Ivy had made. Slowly, like night melting into morning, Ivy's color began to return. Blessing convinced her to sip warm custard and then take a few grapes. Ethan watched from the doorway, arms folded, emotions a tangled ball of relief and confusion. The sight before him, his daughter blooming under the presence of the very woman who had once flung disdain at him, was humbling. After Ivy fell asleep, Blessing rose to leave, but Ethan stopped her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "She really cares about you." Blessing glanced at him. "She's a remarkable child." He nodded, then hesitated. "You're welcome any time. For her." The words hung in the air, tentative and strange. Blessing nodded, then turned and left. But the next evening she returned, and then again 2 days later. Soon it became a rhythm, the kind hearts beat to when trying not to admit they've changed. What began as an obligation soon wove itself into routine. Blessing started looking forward to the visits, not just for Ivy's sake, but because something about that house no longer felt hostile. Ethan was warming, cautiously but surely. He still kept his word short, but they now had softness at the edges. He would bring her tea while she and Ivy painted. Sometimes he'd linger in the doorway with curious eyes, watching them blend colors like magic. One evening he showed her Ivy's old paintings, tucked away in a dusty cupboard. She stopped after her mother died, he said, his voice stripped bare. Blessing glanced at him, her hand instinctively touching his. "She's painting again now," she whispered. That night they sat longer than usual in the living room after Ivy had gone to bed. Their conversation tiptoed from cautious pleasantries to shared stories of loss. He talked about his wife, how her absence still whistled through the hallways like an unfinished song. Blessing spoke of her father's unreachable standards, of a childhood filled with applause but no affection. When their eyes met across the rim of teacups, something fragile passed between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was the birth of a deeper seeing, a recognition that the person you once dismissed might be the only one who truly understands the ache you carry. There was a quietness between them now, the kind that didn't scream for attention but hummed like an old record playing in the background, unnoticed at first, but gradually impossible to ignore. Blessing had stopped keeping count of how many times she visited the Graymore house. The visits no longer needed invitations. They flowed with the ease of a river that had long given up trying to understand its own curves. Ivy would light up the moment she stepped through the door, always with a new drawing to show or a new story to tell, her excitement spilling like rice from a careless vendor's basket. Ethan, on the other hand, remained more restrained, watching, noting, offering tea, or occasionally joining their conversations like someone easing into unfamiliar water. Blessing noticed things she hadn't before, the way he adjusted his sleeves before sitting down, how he rarely laughed but often smirked, how his eyes softened when Ivy giggled. There was a day Ivy sketched the three of them sitting at the kitchen table, Blessing, Ethan, and herself, all smiling like they belonged. Blessing stared at that drawing longer than she should have, heart caught in her throat like a bird trapped in a net. She didn't recognize herself in that picture, not because of how Ivy drew her, but because she looked happy, whole. She couldn't remember the last time she'd looked that way, even to herself. It wasn't all smooth edges and fairy tales. There were days when her insecurities crawled out from under her skin like termites from hiddenwood, days when she stared at the mirror and questioned why she kept returning. Blessing had spent most of her adult life crafting herself into someone untouchable, unreachable, a portrait hung high enough that no child's sticky fingers could smear it. Now, here she was, taking calls in the middle of the night because Ivy had dreamed of a monster under her bed. Here she was, baking banana bread just because the child had once mentioned liking it. The walls around her weren't just cracking. They were giving way to light, to air, to feelings she didn't know she could still feel. Lizzie began to notice the changes, too. One evening, as they sat on the porch drinking warm cocoa, she said, "You're different." Blessing raised a brow. "How?" Lizzie tilted her head, steadying her. "You're lighter, like someone who finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long." Blessing didn't deny it. She merely sipped her drink and whispered, "Ivy's like sunshine. You don't plan to stand in it, but once it hits you, you forget what the cold felt like." Lizzie smiled knowingly, but said nothing more. Still, there was a shadow behind her eyes, one that Blessing didn't fully notice at the time, a small sadness that flickered like a candle nearly out. Lizzie had always known Blessing to be sharp-tongued and guarded, yet now she was watching her friend soften, and it stirred something unnamed in her, part joy, part worry. The day Ethan brought her the blank canvas, Blessing felt something shift beneath her ribs. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with a red string, and placed beside her art supplies without ceremony. "For you," he had said simply, "in case you want to paint something new." She had stared at it for hours that night, sitting cross-legged on the floor as the moonlight spilled across her room like spilled milk. That canvas felt like a question, one that asked not what she had lost, but what she dared to build from scratch. The next morning, she painted. It wasn't Ivy's face this time, nor a field of sunflowers, nor the memories that had haunted her like stray cats in alleyways. She painted peace, a room with open windows, a girl in a loose dress dancing barefoot on wooden floors, a man leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed but smiling, a child twirling, paintbrush in hand, spilling color everywhere. When she was done, she titled it Possibility. She showed it to Ethan later that week, heart fluttering like a moth near fire. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a voice that trembled slightly at the edges, he said, "I didn't know I could fall in love again." Blessing looked up, startled. Not because of the words, but because she felt the same. It wasn't fireworks or violin music. It was the quiet, steady realization that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found something worth risking her walls for. They didn't tell Ivy immediately. Children had a way of making a small thing feel like a wedding, and Blessing didn't want pressure, not yet. But Ivy wasn't slow. She noticed how her father lingered longer near the studio, how he smiled more easily, how Blessing no longer knocked before entering. One Saturday morning, while brushing her teeth, she peeked into the kitchen and saw her father placing his hand on Blessing's lower back as she poured cereal. Her scream of joy echoed through the house like a firecracker. "Are you getting married?" she shouted, mouth still full of foam. They both burst into laughter, exchanging the kind of look that didn't need words. That night, as Ivy lay curled in her bed, she whispered to Blessing, "I always knew you were my person." Blessing stroked her hair and whispered back, "You found me first." Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Chief Dominic Adebayo sat in his marble-floored mansion, utterly unaware that his daughter, his brilliant, law-trained, artistically rebellious daughter, was slowly slipping out of the mold he carved for her. Blessing hadn't told him anything yet. She didn't know how to. And that felt like freedom. Not the kind you shout about, but the kind that wraps around you quietly and makes the world feel possible again. The day the engagement ring appeared, the sun had only just stretched itself over the rooftops, yawning into the streets below like a king rising from slumber. Blessing had come to the Graymore house to drop off a sketchbook Ivy had forgotten during their last painting session. It was supposed to be a short visit, no tea, no lingering looks, no lingering at all. Just in and out like someone returning a borrowed umbrella. But when she stepped through the door, everything felt off balance. The lights were dimmed, the aroma of cinnamon and cardamom drifted from the kitchen, and Ethan stood near the dining table, dressed like a man with something up his sleeve. "You're early," he said, his smile slightly nervous, his fingers betraying a small tremble as they toyed with the edge of the tablecloth. "I didn't want to leave it at the gate," Blessing replied, holding up the sketchbook like a shield. "It's Ivy's favorite." Ethan nodded, stepped forward, and gently took it from her hands, setting it aside. "Wait here," he said. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the hallway. Blessing stood there, awkward, suspicious, the air thick with an emotion she couldn't name. A minute later, he returned, not with tea, not with ivy, but with a small wooden box, the kind that looked like it held secrets. He didn't kneel. He didn't give a speech. He simply opened the box and held it toward her. Inside was a simple ring with a thin gold band, a tiny diamond, and a painting, miniature, almost hidden, of Ivy's smile etched delicately onto the inner rim. She picked it, Ethan said, eyes steady. She said if I ever asked you, it had to be something that felt like home. Blessing didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She only whispered, "You people will not kill me with this kind of love." Word traveled like wildfire doused in kerosene. Lizzie was the first to react, and she did so with the kind of theatrical disbelief usually reserved for soap operas. She marched into the living room the following evening, eyes wide, mouth agape, phone in one hand and a half-eaten meat pie in the other. "Engaged?" she repeated, as though the word had committed a personal offense against her vocabulary. Blessing, who was reclining on the couch sketching, didn't even look up. "You're shouting," she said calmly. "Why are you shouting?" Lizzie dropped the meat pie like it had turned into stone. "To a man with a child?" "To a man with a name," Blessing replied, flipping her page. "And a child who saved me." Lizzie stared at her, then slowly sat down, her expression softening. "You hated children, Blessing. You couldn't stand the sight of them. What happened?" Blessing placed her pencil down, finally meeting her friend's eyes. "Ivy happened, and I let her." There was a pause, long enough for both women to sip from the silence. Lizzie sighed. "I always knew you had a soft spot. You just covered it with thorns." Blessing smiled, not the coy, dismissive kind, but the one that stretched from a place of deep peace. "And now I've found soil where the thorns can bloom." Lizzie shook her head, but a grin tugged at the corners of her lips. "This is the part of the movie where I get jealous and betray you, you know." Blessing threw a pillow at her, and they laughed until tears joined the mirth. Somewhere between the giggles, the weight of the past began to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. Chief Dominic Adebayo received the news like someone had poured cold water on his silk-lined dreams. He was in the middle of a meeting when his assistant handed him the wedding invitation, a tastefully crafted card in cream and gold, embossed with a sketch of Blessing and Ivy holding hands, the child grinning with all her teeth, Blessing smiling gently beside her. At first, he thought it was a joke. A publicity stunt. His daughter couldn't be marrying someone with a child. Not his daughter. Not the future senior advocate he had polished and paraded like a trophy. But the reality settled quickly, as sour truths often do. Blessing didn't call him. She didn't explain. She didn't ask for permission. And that silence echoed louder than any confrontation. He held the invitation with a trembling hand, staring at the name Ethan Graymore like it was written in foreign ink. "Artist," he murmured bitterly. "From law chambers to crayons and coloring books." He tossed the card on the table, dismissing the assistant with a wave. But for the rest of that evening, he was silent. And when his wife later asked what was bothering him, he simply said, "The child I molded has become clay in someone else's hands." Yet somewhere deep inside the fortress of pride he had built, a crack began to form. Because even men like Dominic, men who worship success like an altar, know the smell of real joy when it drifts close enough. And joy had never lingered long in Blessing's voice when she spoke to him, not the way it now rang in the ink of that invitation. The days leading up to the engagement party were filled with a kind of chaos that felt like music out of tune but full of rhythm. Ivy insisted on helping with the decor, drawing sunflowers on every place card until her fingers turned yellow. Ethan, in his usual composed manner, coordinated logistics while sneaking glances at Blessing whenever he thought she wasn't looking. And Blessing? She floated. Not like a feather tossed by wind, but like a leaf that had finally chosen its river. Her mornings were quieter, her laughter deeper, her sketches more vivid. She painted again, not because she had to, but because life now pulsed through her fingertips. And she painted Ivy the most. One morning, while organizing a few framed works for the event, Ivy tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Will you be my mom?" Blessing knelt beside her, heart drumming like a talking drum played by trembling hands. "If you'll have me," she whispered. Ivy grinned. "I already do." That night, after Ivy had gone to sleep and the house wore the hush of tired joy, Ethan came to sit beside her on the porch. They didn't say much, just watched the stars hold their place in the sky. Then he reached out and took her hand, quiet, firm, and steady. And in that moment, nothing needed to be spoken. The artist who hated children, the widower who had forgotten how to feel, the child who drew them together with nothing but light. Their story had begun long before they realized, stitched quietly into the background of a life they thought they were living alone. The sky held its breath that morning, as though even the clouds knew something sacred was unfolding beneath them. The engagement party wasn't extravagant. Blessing had insisted on simplicity. She wanted warmth, not spectacle. A small garden in Harrow's End, beneath a flowering almond tree that had bloomed too early for the season, was where they gathered. Ivy wore a yellow dress that made her look like bottled sunlight, and she had personally arranged the place cards with little stick figure sketches of each guest. Ethan wore navy blue, sleeves rolled just enough to make him look like a man ready to build, not pose. Blessing, in a flowing off-shoulder gown the color of wet earth, held Ivy's hand as they greeted guests like a pair of hosts born for connection. There was no stage, no choir, no over-the-top fanfare, just laughter that rose like incense and gentle music humming from unseen speakers tucked among potted ferns. People mingled, whispered, smiled. The sun, obliging, kept its fire soft, spreading a golden haze that bathed the scene like a painting too beautiful to edit. Lizzie stood nearby, drinking Chapman and watching her friend glow with a piece she hadn't seen since their days of scribbling notes in law school cafeterias. A slow grin spread across her face, not the amused kind she wore when teasing, but something deeper, something proud. She walked over, nudged Blessing lightly, and said, "You wore skepticism like armor for so long. I almost forgot what your skin looked like without it." Blessing's laugh spilled easily, soft as silk against skin. "Turns out love didn't need an invitation," she said. "It barged in anyway, wearing size 3 sandals and asking for crayons." After the guests had filtered out and the final crumbs of puff-puff had been swept away, the house slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But a shift had taken place, quiet yet irreversible. Ivy now called her Mum without hesitation, sometimes casually, sometimes with the weight of everything she had longed to say but didn't know how. And Blessing, who once saw children as intrusions, found herself reading bedtime stories, tying shoelaces, and waiting anxiously outside bathrooms like a seasoned parent. It was like learning to dance without music, awkward at first, but eventually the rhythm revealed itself. Ethan, ever the silent, steady hand, supported them both with the calm of a man who had walked through fire and learned to build shelter from its ashes. He never rushed, never demanded. His love was the kind that didn't flare, but glowed, a lantern you didn't realize you were following until it had already led you home. One quiet evening, after Ivy had fallen asleep mid-sentence with a sketchbook across her chest, Blessing sat on the porch staring at the stars. Ethan joined her, handing her a cup of mint tea. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "Do you think your father would have liked me?" Ethan smiled faintly, eyes resting on the moon. "He would have been confused by you, then quietly impressed. And when he saw what you've done with Ivy, how she's come alive again, he'd have asked you to paint his portrait." Blessing chuckled, then leaned her head on his shoulder. There, under the blanket of evening, nothing needed mending. For the first time in her adult life, Blessing didn't feel like she was waiting to prove herself to anyone. But all stories have a thread of reality that tugs just when the bow seems perfectly tied. One afternoon, Blessing received a letter, handwritten in her father's script, tight, deliberate, and unmistakably controlled. He had heard about the engagement, the child, the so-called artist's life she had finally embraced. But instead of rage or scolding, the words were cautious. There was no apology, but there was something close. "I don't understand your choices," he wrote, "but I understand that you've made them with conviction. That counts for something." She read it twice, then folded it neatly, slipping it between pages of her sketchbook. That same week, he sent a gift, a large wooden easel with her initials carved at the base BA. The same initials that had once appeared on every law brief he hoped she'd write. She didn't cry. Instead, she spent the rest of the day painting a scene she'd dreamed about for weeks, her father standing in the same garden where she got engaged, watching Ivy draw sunflowers in the dirt, his face neither cold nor pleased, just present, the kind of presence she'd longed for as a child. She didn't know if he'd ever step into that garden in real life, but on canvas, he was already there. And sometimes that's how healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet rewriting of memory until it stops hurting to remember. The evening before their small courthouse ceremony, Blessing hosted one final dinner at the house on Northby Lane, the same house she and Lizzie had almost lost, the same house where Ivy first knocked on her heart's locked door and waited patiently until it opened. The dining table was set under strings of fairy lights, bowls of jollof rice, grilled plantains, and a steaming pot of goat pepper soup filling the air with home. Ivy presented a toast with juice in a plastic cup, her words innocent but wise. "Thank you for saying yes to Daddy and yes to me. Now we can all be one big painting." Everyone laughed, but the tears came too, tears of the kind that know they've arrived at the end of a long, winding road. Lizzie offered a hug that lingered a little longer than usual. Ethan, ever dramatic, took Blessing's hand under the table and simply squeezed. And Blessing, once terrified of being tied down, once convinced that children were interruptions, once buried beneath a father's blueprint, smiled. Not the smile she wore for cameras, not the smile that won her favor at dinners or drew applause from distant relatives, but the smile that came from a soul no longer at war with itself. That night, as she stood by the window watching Ivy sleep beside a half-finished sketch of a house with 3 stick figures labeled Us, Blessing whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for finding her in a pencil aisle in the defiant smile of a little girl who had no idea she was changing someone's world forever. Sometimes the very things we run from are the ones sent to rescue us. Life has a way of planting blessings in places we least expect, behind closed doors, beneath childhood fears, even in the small hands of someone we thought we couldn't love. Don't be so busy protecting your heart that you forget it was made to feel. Love, when it finally finds you, won't always arrive dressed in perfection. It might come as a challenge, a child, or a second chance. Let your heart grow into spaces that scare you. That's often where the healing lives. May your eyes recognize blessings even when they come disguised in inconvenience. May your heart stay open to joy even when fear tries to build a wall. May every shattered plan be replaced with a deeper purpose, and may the love you thought you didn't deserve find you anyway. May your spirit be bold enough to embrace change, and your hands never too tired to hold what truly matters. May your peace overflow like an untamed river, and may your story end not in regret, but in redemption, rest, and real joy. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.